We're going to get started, please. Please take your seats. Thank you all for being here today. Welcome to the FY26 Consensus Revenue hearing. I want to thank everyone for joining us. It's nice to have everyone here fully in person. We have a couple of people online as well. A couple of members of the House are here online. Today we begin the work on the fiscal year FY 2026 budget. My name is Aaron Michlewitz. I'm the House Chair of Ways and Means, and we will be starting today by starting a conversation on setting a responsible consensus revenue number that will allow the Commonwealth to produce a balanced budget, as always, that serves all of our residents. Predicting future revenue figures, as me and my counterpart have seen over the last couple of years, can be a very difficult process in normal times, but given how volatile our revenue has been over the last couple of years, this will be especially challenging. It'll be especially challenging because the Commonwealth not only faces the challenges at home, but we face unprecedented factors on a federal and global stage. But we here in the Commonwealth are well prepared to face any downturns with a rainy day fund at a record $9.1 billion. Just checked with the comptroller today about that. Over the past 6 years alone, we have added nearly $7 billion to that fund, as well as making extra contributions towards our pension liabilities and setting aside revenue reserve funds for the state's obligations towards the Student Opportunity Act. It is safe to say that we will act in the same deliberation and caution as we face the uncertainties that lie ahead. I want to thank my counterpart, co-chair, Senator Rodrigues, as I look forward to working on our 7th budget cycle working together. And I want to thank Secretary Gorzkowicz, and I look forward to working with you and your team as we continue to work over the months and weeks ahead over the FY26 budget. You got the tough job right now of trying to put it together for January. I do want to recognize the members of the House that are here, starting with the Vice Chair of the Committee, Representative Ferrante. And then there are a number of members here, more than I expected, so it's nice to see you all. But I'm going to start from my far right here, Representative Haggerty, Representative Blaze, Representative Murray, Representative Moratori, the Ranking Minority Member, Representative Smola, Representative Vaughn. To my left here, Representative Howard, Representative Lippert-Garabedian, Representative Lenatra, Representative Duffy. Sitting in front of us here is Representative Kearney, Representative Zaharos, Representative Kearns, Representative Sullivan Alameda, I think was here. Yep, there she is. Representative Elliott I saw in the crowd. Chair Stanley is here as well. And then online, we have Representative Higgins, Representative Ramos, Representative Doherty, Representative Barber, Representative Altrino, Representative Kilcoyne. We do not have a quorum yet here, but we're getting there. Maybe by the end of the day we will. I want to thank you all for being here and for all the work that you have done in past budgets and for the work that you're going to do in this upcoming cycle. So thank you. Again, I want to thank all those that are testifying, particularly taking time out of their day to give us some insight on what we're to expect here in the next fiscal year. And with that said, I'm going to turn it over to my friend, my counterpart, and my partner here, Chair Rodrigues.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's hard to believe how fast time flies that this is the 7th budget that we're beginning to work on collaboratively and together as we craft this FY26 budget. I'd like to thank you and all of your team at House Ways and Means. I'd like to thank Secretary Gorzkowicz and all of his team at Administration and Finance. You know, without our commitment to this partnership each of the last few years, our work together to deliver balanced budgets that have built up our rainy day reserves, made key investments to support our long-term economic and fiscal well-being, and met the needs of all 351 cities and towns across this great state would not have been possible. As we all know, today marks an important first step as we kick off the FY26 budget development process. We begin anew to develop a roadmap to a responsible and fiscally sound budget plan while making every effort we can to protect and sustain many of the important investments we have made to move Massachusetts forward. Over the last 2 years, we in the legislature have worked and partnered with Governor Healy, Lieutenant Governor Driscoll, and their team to deliver some critical wins for our Commonwealth and the communities we represent. We delivered historic tax relief, putting money back into the pockets of our constituents who need it most: families, caregivers, commuters, homeowners, renters, and seniors. we doubled down on the Commonwealth's education system, permanently enshrining free community college into law, making game-changing investments in early education, and keeping our commitments to the Student Opportunity Act. We passed the Affordable Homes Act, authorizing more than $5 billion in new investment to boost housing production and placing forward a smorgasbord of new policy initiatives to address the high cost of housing. And more recently, we passed sweeping legislation into law on climate and economic development that invests to stimulate new industries like climate tech and boost proven industries like life sciences, which will further ensure we maintain our Commonwealth's competitive edge in years to come. Together, with these actions, we bet on our state's strengths, which is our people, our world-class educational and medical institution, an omnipresent innovation economy, and the 351 diverse cities and towns that make up the fabric of this great Commonwealth. Now, clear-eyed about the challenges and potential impacts ahead at the federal level, we must continue to work together to further position our state to respond and adjust when necessary. Although our state's economy is resilient and strong, tax collections to date continue to hint that the downward pressure on state spending growth will remain at a time when obligations in areas like education, healthcare, long-term liabilities, and emergency assistance will eat up a chunk of the finite resources available in FY26. To that end, our work will require a steady and stable hand as we continue to tighten our belts. As we begin this new budget cycle, I am confident that a continued approach rooted in a collaborative governance will again lead us to developing a budget for FY26 that is fiscally responsible, promotes continued stability, and protects our state's economic health and well-being. As such, today's hearing is vitally important as we analyze economic forecasts, examine trends, and consider the external factors that may impact our state's economy and our fiscal health in the year ahead. I want to thank everyone for participating in today's hearing as we begin to develop a budget plan for the new fiscal year. I look forward to hearing your testimony today and working with our partners in the Healey-Driscoll administration and the House as we begin to lay this groundwork and develop a responsible roadmap for fiscal year 26. And before I turn this over to our good friend and partner, Secretary Gorzkowicz, I'd like to recognize my Senate colleagues who are with us today. We have the Assistant Vice Chair of the Committee, Senator Joe Comerford. Nice to see you, Senator Comerford. We have Senator John Keenan in the audience. Thank you for being here, Senator Keenan. And I believe that's all I see. I cannot read the names of those online with us. Unfortunately, even with my glasses, my eyes aren't as good as yours, Mr. Chairman. But thank you all for being here. And I'll turn this over now to Secretary Gorzkowicz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon. I'm Matthew Gorzkowicz, Secretary for Administration and Finance. Thank you all for joining us for today's fiscal year 2026 consensus revenue hearing. I want to thank my colleagues in the legislature, led by Chairman Rodrigues and Chairman Michlewitz and their teams. It's been a great collaboration and appreciate working with all of you. And thank you to the accomplished economists and experts we will hear from today. Your insights will provide critical foundation for our revenue forecast and ultimately our FY26 state budget. We're grateful for your time and expertise. With the FY26 budget, our administration will put forward a spending plan that continues to strengthen Massachusetts' position as the best place in the country to live, work, start and own a business, and raise a family. We'll do that by investing in core services for residents, from public health to childcare, and in the sectors that hold promise for our future, like clean energy, climate tech, life sciences, and higher education. We will also continue to leverage the voter-approved fair share surtax to make transformative improvements in education and transportation, maximizing this relatively new resource that has outperformed our original estimates. Just as importantly, our FY26 budget should and must be fiscally responsible and calibrated to ensure that Massachusetts remains on firm financial footing. While our economy is strong, we continue to face difficult fiscal environment, characterized by the juxtaposition of slow revenue growth and rising spending pressures. On the revenue side, both FY23 and FY24 saw year-over-year loss after 2 years of historic tax revenue growth. Specifically, we ended FY24 about $463 million below the revenue shortfall after adjusting for our surtax. We are closely monitoring FY25 collections. As of October, we are about $133 million below year-to-date benchmarks. That includes about a $54 million one-time transfer that will be pulled out. Along with our partners in the legislature, our administration has been closely attuned to the challenging revenue picture. We have taken action to ensure sustainability by managing our spending. In FY25, our budget reflected a 2.3% growth in spending over FY24, well below the rate of inflation. We implemented a modest veto package the legislature has so far sustained, and we are grateful for that. We have taken steps to closely managing hiring and putting controls spending within the executive branch. All of this has been done with an eye towards avoiding the type of mid-year budget cuts we were forced to make in fiscal year 24 and put Massachusetts on a sustainable spending trajectory for not just FY26, but for future years. Even with these actions, we remain clear-eyed about the scale of the challenges ahead and the potential for ongoing misalignment between spending and revenue. Programs such as Mass Health, the Student Opportunity Act, provider rate increases, our pension obligation are just a few of the drivers of spending growth over which we have less discretion. Despite the fiscal constraints we face, our administration has delivered on our goals of making Massachusetts more affordable, competitive, and equitable. We worked with the House and Senate to pass key legislation to address the most pressing issues in Massachusetts, including the 2023 tax cuts, which continue to be fully phased in, the Affordable Homes Act, which is catalyzing the production and preservation of housing, and the Mass Leads Act, a landmark economic development package that supports business growth, creates jobs, and strengthens Massachusetts' global leadership in climate tech and life sciences. We are proud of these accomplishments and of every effort we've made to improve the quality of life in Massachusetts. I look forward to collaborating with Chairs Rodrigues and Michlewitz and their teams to finalize the FY26 consensus revenue figures in preparation for our filing later in January. It is imperative that we successfully navigate the challenging fiscal environment and successfully deliver for the people of Massachusetts. Today, the slate of distinguished economists and experts will enable us to chart that path forward. I am particularly eager to hear projections for what we might see in surtax in FY26 and beyond after collecting more than $2.4 billion in FY24, future trends of interest rates and how that will impact revenue collections, but also our housing market, and also generally how we think changes in Washington might impact our economy, either positively or negatively, to the extent it's possible to predict that. Again, thank you for all those who are speaking with us today, and for those who made this hearing possible. I'll now turn it back over to Chair Michlewitz.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. So we're going to get started, and we will start with Commissioner Snyder from DOR, and I'll let you introduce your team. Thank you so much for being here, Commissioner.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Secretary Gorzkowicz, Chair Rodrigues, Chair Michlewitz, and members of the House and Senate. My name is Jeff Snyder. I'm the Commissioner of the Department of Revenue. With me today is Kazim Ozier. Kazim is our Chief Economist and Director of the Office of Tax Analysis. Tim Rooney is DOR's Chief Financial Officer, and Rebecca Forder, to my right, is Deputy Commissioner for Tax Policy. Thank you for inviting us here today, and we are pleased to present the Department's outlook for Massachusetts state tax revenues for FY25 and 26. Maybe not. Anybody got an idea how this works?
Okay. All set. That's next.
Well, that's Dr. Goodman. Nope. Somebody want to help?
Yeah.
I could do his. Uh-oh.
Everyone has handouts, though.
Okay. Everybody has handouts. Let's do it the old-fashioned way.
Do it the old-fashioned way.
All right? All right. Well, we're going to look at slide 2. Today our focus is on FY 25 and 26, but we think a recap of FY 24 will provide helpful context. So collections in FY 24 were $40.8 billion. That was $967 million above the 24 benchmark and $1.636 billion more than the amount collected in FY 23. The results were significantly impacted by the surtax revenue. We estimate that FY 24 surtax revenue totaled $2.429 billion, which was $1.429 billion above the surtax benchmark and $2.187 billion more than the surtax collections in FY 23. After adjusting for the surtax, collections in FY 24 totaled $38.371 billion. That was $463 million below the FY 24 benchmark and $552 million less than the amount collected in FY 23. DOR also certified that capital gains tax revenue in FY 24, excluding those generated from the surtax, totaled $2.009 billion. Let's go to slide 3. So let's talk about FY 25 and FY 26 forecasts. First, we face a number of areas of uncertainty in FY 25 and 26, and tax collections will vary depending on many factors, including 1, the potential impact of the President-elect's full suite of policy proposals and their impact on inflation, interest rates, and the economy in general. We have the possible elimination of and/or changes to the $10,000 federal limit on the deduction for state and local taxes, better known as the SALT cap. It's set to expire in December 31 of 25. Our forecasts assume that the cap will be extended without changes. We have a worsening of geopolitical risks, including the Middle East and the Russia-Ukraine conflicts, and their potential impact on energy prices and inflation. We have the Federal Reserve policy. Will the Fed continue to ease monetary policy, and at what pace? What's the duration? What's the destination? And we have other significant global, domestic, and political factors. Our 25 and 26 forecasts are based in part on the economic projections provided by our economic vendors. They would be Moody's Analytics and S&P Global. Both have developed projections based on various scenarios, and we have incorporated those into our forecasts. In addition to the vendors' projections, our 25 and 26 forecasts also reflect the results so far for the FY 25 year-to-date preliminary tax collections as of the end of October of 24. So let's look at slide 5. Oh, we're up.
Oh, there we go.
Nice. Thank you. Thank you. You're the man. So FY 25 year-to-date through October totaled $12.512 billion. That's $129 million below the year-to-date benchmark. However, after you exclude the estimate for our year-to-date surtax revenue of $585 million, which, by the way, is $244 million above the surtax benchmark, you would get year-to-date revenue collections of $11.927 billion, which is $372 million below the year-to-date benchmark. The results excluding the surtax reflect lower than expected collections in all the major tax categories. Income withholding, which was driven by slow employment growth and moderate wage growth, sales tax reflecting the impact of higher consumer debt and the lingering impact of past inflation, as well as lower collections from businesses that have been affected by the weakness in residential and commercial real estate markets. And then corporate and business taxes that have resulted from lower than expected estimated payments, return payments, and higher than expected refunds. Although November is not yet final, total collections as of the mid-month were moderately higher than collections during the same period in November of 23. And we expect this trend to continue for the rest of the month. We'll be putting out, November collections will be published December 4th, 2 days. Next slide. Thank you. With the enactment of the FY25 budget, the Secretary of A&F established the FY25 tax revenue benchmark estimate of $41.607 billion, which included $1.3 billion of surtax revenue. Excluding our estimate of surtax collections, DOR forecasts FY25 revenue to be in the range of $39.447 billion to $40.063 billion. It's a decrease of between $860 million and $244 million from the benchmark. For FY26, excluding the surtax, DOR forecasts revenue to be in the range of $40.206 billion to $41.286 billion, which is between 1.9% and 3.1% higher than our FY25 forecast. We forecast the revenue impact of the surtax in FY25 to be in the range of $2.349 billion to $2.491 billion, and FY26 a range of between $2.186 billion and $2.561 billion. If you include the surtax, our forecast is between $188 million and $947 million higher than the FY25 revenue benchmark, and our FY26 forecast is between 1.4% and 3% higher than our FY25 forecast. Now we'd like to provide some details about our forecast for each of the 6 categories, beginning with income tax. Income tax revenues are driven by employment, wages and salaries, capital gains, income from dividends and interest, and non-corporate business income. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, U.S. total non-farm payroll employment rose by about 1.4% over the 12 months ending October of 24. And the U.S. average hourly earnings increased by 4% over the same period. Massachusetts employment grew at a slower rate than that of the U.S. Massachusetts total non-farm payroll grew by 0.9% over the 12 months ended October of 24, and the average hourly earnings in Massachusetts grew by 2.3%. The U.S. equity markets, as measured by the S&P, have performed extremely well over the last 12 months. However, our vendors are projecting much more modest growth in FY26. As mentioned, our forecasts assume the $10,000 SALT cap will be extended beyond December 31 of 25 expiration date. However, if Congress should allow the cap to expire, it will have a materially negative impact on future income tax revenues because of the elective pass-through entity, or PTE excise. The PTE excise allows members of a pass-through entity to avoid the $10,000 SALT cap by electing to pay tax on the PTE's income at the entity level and then claim a credit equal to 90% of the PTE excise paid on their individual returns. The remaining 10% of the PTE excise is retained as tax revenue for the Commonwealth. If the SALT cap is allowed to expire, PTEs would no longer make excise payments, which would eliminate that 10% of excise payments retained as tax revenue. In addition, entity members will still be able to use unclaimed PTE credits from prior tax years to reduce their income tax liability in future tax years. That will result in an additional reduction in tax revenue. DOR estimates the combined negative impact to future fiscal year tax revenues is approximately $1 billion, much of which would be realized in FY26 and FY27. Slide 6, please. Before including the surtax, FY25 income taxes are forecast to be between $209 million lower and $115 million higher than the FY25 benchmark of $22.987 billion. As mentioned, we forecast surtax collections to be in the range of $2.349 billion and $2.491 billion in FY25. $1.049 billion to $1.19 billion higher than the FY25 surtax benchmark of $1.3 billion. With the inclusion of surtax collections, FY25 income taxes are forecasted to be between $840 million and $1.306 billion higher than the FY25 benchmark of $24.287 billion. Withholding. Given year-to-date collections and Massachusetts' current labor market conditions, characterized by slow employment growth and moderate wage growth, withholding tax collections, excluding the surtax, are forecasted to be between $234 million and $105 million lower than the FY25 benchmark of $18.307 billion. Capital gains. Based on the current DOR estimate of capital gains tax collected through September 30th, 2024 of $289 million, and recent financial market performance, our FY25 capital gains forecast, excluding capital gains generated from the surtax, is between $2.288 billion and $2.419 billion. That compares with the FY25 capital gains benchmark, again excluding the surtax, of $2.077 billion. Next slide, please. Let's look at sales tax. Total sales tax receipts for the first 4 months of FY25 are 2.2% below the year-to-date benchmark. Regular sales tax is 0.7% below, meals tax 1.9% below, and motor vehicle sales are 10.3% below their respective year-to-date benchmarks. Based in part on this year-to-date collections, we forecast total sales tax receipts in FY25 to be between $319 to $163 million, lower than the FY25 benchmark of $9.829 billion. Corporate and excise and business excise. FY25 year-to-date corporate and business tax collections, which as you all know are one of the more volatile revenue categories, is 8.6 below the year-to-date benchmark. FY25 corporate and business tax revenue collections are forecasted to be below the FY25 benchmark of $5.017 billion by between $314 and $230 million. All other collections in the all other category for the first 4 months are 1.8% below the year-to-date benchmark, reflecting decreases mostly in rooms and estate taxes. In FY25, the all other tax category is forecasted to be between $19 million below and $35 million above the benchmark of $2.474 billion. Next slide. For 26. In FY26, total income taxes, excluding the surtax, are forecasted to increase by between 2.7 and 4.1% from our FY25 income tax forecast. As mentioned, our forecast assumes the $10,000 SALT cap is extended. However, again, if the cap were to expire, it would have a significant negative impact on income tax revenues. Withholding taxes are forecasted to increase between 4.2 and 4.8% from the FY25 forecast, driven in part by our vendors' projections of slow employment growth, but improving wage growth compared to current conditions. Capital gains are volatile and challenging to predict. Although financial markets have performed well in recent months, our vendors are projecting much lower growth in FY26. Our capital gains, in addition, our capital gains tax forecast for FY25 is better than originally expected, which could mean taxpayers will have fewer gains to realize in FY26. As a result of these four factors, we forecast capital gains to be between $2.129 billion and $2.335 billion, which is between 7% and 3.4% lower than our FY25 capital gains forecast. Slide 9, please. In FY26, our economic vendors project retail sales to increase by approximately 3%. DOR forecasts sales tax revenues to increase by 2.7% to 3.4% from our FY25 sales tax forecast. Corporate and business tax receipts are forecasted to decrease by 3.2% to 2.1% from our FY25 forecast. And in the all other category, it's forecasted to increase by between 1.2% to 2.0% from our FY25 forecast. Slide 10. So let's recap. Excluding the surtax, FY25 revenue is forecasted to be between $39.447 billion and $40.063 billion. That's 2.1% to 0.6% less than the FY25 benchmark ex surtax of $40.307 billion. We forecast FY26 revenue excluding surtax in the range of $40.206 to $41.286 billion. It's between 1.9% and 3.1% above the FY25 revenue forecast. Our forecast for the surtax is between $2.349 billion and $2.491 billion in FY25, and $2.186 billion and $2.561 billion in FY26. The FY25 year-to-date tax revenues after adjusting for the surtax are $372 million below the year-to-date benchmark. Current Massachusetts labor markets conditions are characterized by slow employment growth and moderate wage growth. Our economic vendors are projecting moderate growth in the Massachusetts economy. The key risk factors to our forecast include the President-elect's full suite of policy proposals, possible changes to the $10,000 federal cap on state and local tax deductions, the path, the duration, and destination of Federal Reserve's monetary policy, and the worsening geopolitical risk, including the Middle East and the Russia-Ukraine conflicts. Due to these risk factors, there's significant degree of uncertainty in both the vendor economic projections and the tax revenue forecasts. We will continue to closely monitor these risk factors and the impact they may have on the state economy and tax revenue collections. We've distributed copies of our supporting documents. Thank you for your time and the opportunity to present our forecasts, and we are available to respond to any questions now or in the future.
Thank you, Commissioner, and to your team for all the work that you've done in the past, and obviously in presenting today some of these numbers. There's a lot of numbers here. Obviously, you threw a lot at us here. But I do want to just single out the surtax conversation real quick and just get an understanding. Sounds like from where you see things have gone so far, not 50% into the fiscal year, but certainly a little bit of indicators from estimated income tax collections. It looks like we're either going to be like stabilized on the surtax, or maybe a little bit even below FY24 once all said and done in collecting FY25 from that range you gave us. Is that accurate to say? And is that what you're seeing in terms of from where we were last November or December at this point in time?
Yes, and that might seem a little strange, but there's a timing issue of when we're receiving surtax, right? So this year it's different than it was last year. Last year there was no incentive for anyone to pay because there was a grace period from any kind of lack of payment penalties. This year, not so much.
All right, that's good to know. I'm going to turn it over to my counterpart here. Did you have any questions, Senator Rodrigues?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had a number of questions, but you seem to have answered them all in your testimony, so well done. I want to thank you and your team for, as always, being there for us for when I or my team has any questions for you. But I did have questions around the surtax. I had questions around the SALT deductions and PTE ramifications should that not be extended, and you answered those questions in your testimony, so I thank you very much.
Secretary Gorzkowicz.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you to your team. I don't have any questions. I know we have an opportunity to talk often, and so I appreciate your testimony and want to, again, thank your team for pulling this information together and providing today's testimony, so thank you.
Vice Chair Ferrante.
Good afternoon, Commissioner. I have 2 questions for you. Relative to the millionaire's tax and the exodus of Massachusetts residents to other states, have you done any work around what the impact of the number of workers and taxable people here in the Commonwealth, the impact of them leaving on future revenues?
Based on the current data we have and have available to us, we really cannot tell you with any degree of certainty on whether people have left the Commonwealth because of the surtax, right? The data that seems to be the most accurate lags. It comes from the IRS, and that truly lags by, what, 18, 24 months?
18, 20 months, yes.
Right. So we're not going to get a look at that until a little while. The anecdotal evidence, you know, we all know people, we talk to tax preparers, they are not shy about telling us that, you know, it's part of the conversation with their clients, but I can't give you anything, no hard data. And I haven't found a place we can find it yet.
It's just a follow-up question. Do you have the number of taxpayers? Can you certify the number of individuals who paid taxes, income tax, in the previous fiscal year to this fiscal year, and to allow us to see a trend of where that's going?
I'm not sure. I mean, we know the number of taxpayers, and we know the number of taxpayers by quintile. We know the ones who are subject to the surtax. So we have all that. And based on where we are, the numbers are as we would have expected. But what happens with the surtax, and as we looked at past data, what happens with the surtax is a significant number of people who are subject to the surtax are subject once or twice, right? They just kind of get over. Maybe it's the sale of a home or something like that. So again, happy to share what we can of that data.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Sure.
I'd just like to open up to any other members of the committee that may want to ask a question here. I don't see anybody. If not, going once, going twice. All right. Commissioner, thank you so much. And to your team, thank you again for your testimony and your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Treasurer Goldberg here. Madam Treasurer, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Just turn it on. There's a button at the, no, there's a button at the base of it. There you go.
Here we go. Okay then. Thank you. So, Secretary Gorzkowicz, Chairman Michlewitz, and Chairman Rodrigues, members of the committee. How are you all today? I always appreciate the opportunity to have an open conversation with you about our revenue projections and the fiscal outlook for Massachusetts. So let's start with everyone's favorite, the lottery. The lottery had another solid performance in fiscal year 2024, setting new records for revenue, prize payouts, and retailer commissions, with total revenues topping the $6 billion mark for the second year in a row. To be exact, $6.168 billion. The lottery returned $1.159 billion to cities and towns. We paid out $4.525 billion in prizes, and our retail partners received over $350 million in commissions and bonuses. The lottery is currently on track to meet its projection of $1.050 billion in net profit for fiscal year 2025, despite economic headwinds and continuing impacts from the competitive marketplace. Looking forward to fiscal year 2026, the lottery projects flat sales at retail and therefore a flat net profit of $1.050 billion. Lotteries across the country are facing increasing unpredictability of multi-state game sales driven by large jackpots. During the first 5 months of fiscal year 2025, our combined Mega Millions and Powerball sales are more than $100 million behind last year. This decrease in sales accounts for almost $40 million in net profit being lost in just the first 5 months of this current fiscal year alone. Through the hard work and innovation of the lottery team, we've been able to introduce new games and modify existing ones. We introduced our second $50 scratch ticket and a Jaws ticket that includes trips to Martha's Vineyard this coming July to coincide with the 50th anniversary of the iconic film. To attract more sales, we made changes to Megabucks, increasing the number of jackpot winners and improving the overall odds of winning prizes. The investments made last year in our monitor budget are already paying off. By dedicating these funds to marketing, the development and introduction of new HD graphics and additional game promotions, Keno has flourished. While we see a reduction in sales for instant tickets, which is down 1.2%, and draw games, which are down 33.4%, our Keno sales are up 3.3%. If this trend continues for the remainder of the current fiscal year, this $1 million investment will translate to roughly $7 million in added net profit. Last and certainly not least, we are looking forward to implementing iLottery, which will help us compete in an increasingly saturated market. I know many of you have heard from Executive Director Mark Bracken, yes, and my team about how necessary the funding is to start up iLottery. Assuming funding is received by January 1st, the lottery hopes to go live with its full suite of online offerings in the summer of 2026. Based on this timeline, we do not currently anticipate any revenue from iLottery in fiscal year 2026. In the first full year of operation, Massachusetts can expect over $70 million in net profit from online sales, and that number quickly scales to over $180 million by year 3, over $230 million in year 5, and almost $360 million in year 10. Now, let's turn to one of my favorite topics, the Stabilization Fund. I would like to begin by thanking the administration and the legislature for your continued commitment to sound fiscal practices. The balance in the fund is a strong $8.4 billion. In September, you passed legislation, an act to provide for competitiveness and infrastructure in Massachusetts that provides us with the opportunity to utilize the significant investment returns generated by the fund to support state match contributions for the purposes of competing for federal discretionary grant opportunities as well as other capital investments. This creative approach will leverage interest earnings to secure federal funding for infrastructure projects across the state, supporting critical transportation, clean water, and climate resiliency needs. This strategy is a fiscally responsible way to access resources without adding to our outstanding liabilities. Already for fiscal year 2024, this has resulted in $375 million of interest earnings being transferred to the Commonwealth Federal Matching and Debt Reduction Fund. At our investor conference 2 weeks ago, we heard from Quentin Palfrey, Director of Federal Funds and Infrastructure, who updated our investors with the Commonwealth's various federal grant wins in this highly competitive process. As an aside, thanks to the hard work of my debt team, we are one of the few states that hosts an annual investor conference. In fact, we have had other states, including Rhode Island and New York, attend our conference to get ideas for hosting their own. Your continued commitment also increased the allowable stabilization fund balance to be 25.5% of total budgeted revenues of the immediately preceding fiscal year. This will enable us to continue our strong fiscal practices. I would also like to thank you for including a provision in the fiscal year 2025 budget to dedicate $250 million annually from income tax surtax revenues to the Commonwealth Transportation Fund. We are working in partnership with the Executive Office for Administration and Finance to use these funds to add a new diversified revenue stream to this important credit, as well as to increase its funding capacity. Now to PRIM. At Mass PRIM, our carefully constructed portfolio continues to deliver in both strong and weak markets. It now sits at $110.5 billion, the highest balance in the fund's history, despite persistent geopolitical and economic crises. The fund continues to perform very strongly with a trailing one-year gain of 16.4% net of fees through September 30th, 2024. The trailing 5- and 10-year returns are also strong, outperforming our benchmarks and, most importantly, above the 7% actuarial target rate of return. To put our consistent growth into perspective, the fund totaled $60 billion when I became treasurer. It has since grown by 84.2%, all while providing approximately $1 billion in benefits to retired public servants on an annual basis. The fund also continues to advance its work with diverse investment managers through the Future Initiative, created to implement the investment equity legislation passed in 2021. As a result of this effort, PRIM's allocation to firms owned and operated by women, people of color, and those with disabilities is now more than $13.7 billion, or nearly 12.5%. Last year, I also announced our newly created Stewardship and Sustainability Committee that was designed to put PRIM on the forefront of sustainable investing. Our Stewardship and Sustainability Committee is now fully operational, and it has already made strides towards assessing how the fund is best positioned to address material environmental and social factors that affect fund performance. The committee has engaged in a research-based, data-driven approach to identify stewardship priorities. These priorities, which include climate transition planning, fair pay, sustainable forestry, and transparency, are areas of high potential risk mitigation and value creation within the PRIT fund. By using a systematic materiality-based process, Mass PRIM is pioneering an approach to stewardship that is forward-looking and innovative while remaining anchored to our fiduciary duty to ensure the long-term value of the PRIT fund. PRIM is truly an industry leader. I am proud of the steps that we have taken to maximize opportunity and sustainability alongside returns. Moving on to unclaimed property, and by the way, I hope each and every one of you have checked the publication. We're happy to help if you need any help with that. I am pleased to report the division continues to provide superior service, reuniting owners with lost assets. The website, findmassmoney.gov, had over 62 million page views in fiscal year 2024. The division paid 131,000 claims, of which 66,120 of these were approved for immediate payment without the claimant having to fill out any additional paperwork due to our fast-track verification process. In an effort to reach a wider audience and to properly reflect the diversity of our population, the division integrated a translation tool on its website, allowing our full website to be instantly translated into 10 languages. Since this launch, the website has been translated 46,000 times. In fiscal year 2024, the division returned over $145 million in cash and $16 million in securities on the 131,000 claims. This totals a return of unclaimed funds to $167 million to individuals and businesses across the Commonwealth. Unclaimed property was able to revert over $199 million to the Commonwealth in fiscal year 2024. For the current fiscal year 2025, the division is still on track to meet its reversion estimate of $175 million. For For this upcoming fiscal year, the division is estimating reverting $197 million in fiscal year 2026. And finally, the Alcoholic Beverages Control Commission. The hospitality industry is a major economic driver for the state. The ABCC has partnered directly with the legislature, administration, municipalities, industry leaders, and businesses to identify ways to maintain public safety while enhancing growth. This effort has included proactive steps to streamline the application process and educate all stakeholders. The ABCC has expanded its targeted outreach to support entrepreneurs who are women and people of color and conducted 30 outreach events with over 2,030 attendees across the Commonwealth. In fiscal year 2024, the ABCC generated $6.3 million in revenue for the state, and we project $6.4 million in fiscal year 2025 and in fiscal year 2026. With all license renewal requirements in place, the annual license renewal process for 2025 is well underway. Since the reports on licenses and transactions are by calendar year, we will have the annual numbers available soon. The ABCC is a lean operation that recognizes its impact on the business community and its connection to economic growth. I look forward to working with you to further enhance operations as we seek new and innovative ways to promote these local and statewide businesses. In conclusion, thank you again for inviting me to testify today. I know we will still have many more conversations about these issues in the weeks and months ahead. I look forward always to our continued collaboration, and now I am happy to answer any and all questions.
Thank you, Madam Treasurer. I'll turn it over. I have no questions. Thank you to your team and everyone for providing the information, the testimony, and all the work that you've continued to do with us here in the legislature. We appreciate it. I'll turn it over to my counterparts here if they have any questions. Or...
Thank you very much. Oh, thank you. Sorry. Thank you very much, Madam Treasurer. Just one question. So, online lottery, nothing in calendar fiscal year 25. We don't see that happening.
No, in fact, we're still awaiting funding so we can then kick everything off. We're not seeing anything for 2026 until midway through 2026,
Okay.
if the funding comes into place.
Okay, thank you.
I don't have any questions. Thank you, and thank you for your team. Appreciate your collaboration and partnership.
And we appreciate it with all of you.
I'd open up to any questions or comments from members of the committee. Anybody? Okay. Thank you, Madam Treasurer. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
I just wanted to recognize we were joined by Representative Beal, who is here as well. Thank you for being here. Going to move it along to, from the Mass Taxpayers Foundation, Doug Howgate is here.
Good afternoon, everyone. Chair Michlewitz, Chair Rodrigues, Secretary Gorzkowicz, members of the committees. My name is Doug Howgate. I'm the president of the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation, and thank you as always for the opportunity to present the foundation's revenue estimates for the current fiscal year 2025, and next year's estimates, fiscal year 26. I'll also touch upon a couple issues we would view as kind of pivotal, both to revenue in FY26, but also kind of the budget development process. But before I do that, I do just want to take a moment to thank the teams at A&F, House Ways and Means, Senate Ways and Means, as we kind of end this session, move into the next session. You know, when I think of tax relief legislation in October of last year, federal funds legislation, some of the changes made on child care stabilization stabilization grants and childcare policy, those are issues that MTF has worked quite a bit on and really been happy to, with the accessibility and the willingness to kind of think about recommendations, think about the analysis that we put out. So I really want to thank you and your teams for that. And so I'm going to talk about fiscal year 2025, and I'll start with non-surtax collections, and then we'll talk surtax and then FY26. So in fiscal year 2025, we project total non-surtax revenues of $39.7 billion, which is 2.8% revenue growth. And that's basically driven by income and corporate collections. So we expect capital gains to grow at 4%, withheld income 3.6%, non-withheld a little less, non-withheld non-cap gains at 2.7%, corporate at 3.4%, sales tax weaker positive growth at 2.2%, and then other collections actually to decline by 3%. So when you combine those things together, you get $39.7 billion or 2.8% growth. Now, I will say we are not recommending adjusting the FY 2025 revenue benchmark at this stage of the game, in spite of the projection that you just heard from us. And the reason for that is 4 months into the fiscal year, we have revenue collections growing at 5.6%, and while that may be somewhat surtax driven, we think in the numbers we've actually seen to date, it wouldn't warrant an adjustment, but certainly as you look at fiscal year 2025, that's something that we would suggest that folks continue to monitor. On the surtax side in fiscal year 2025, and we used the preliminary DOR estimate of $2.2 billion to create our surtax estimates, and those numbers I think are adjusting upward a little bit. But our projection for FY25 for surtax is $2.4 billion. And given the $1.3 billion operating budget threshold included in the FY25 budget, that would imply an overage of $1.1 billion or so, which would mean a further $165 million for the Education and Transportation Reserve Fund, and about $965 million for the Education and Transportation Capital and Innovation Fund, right? So that's basically our view on fiscal year 2025. So then building off that into fiscal year 2026, we expect to see continued moderate positive revenue growth, non-surtax, of 3.1% for total collections of $40.9 billion, again, not including the surtax. We again expect to see that as really driven on the income and corporate side. So we are projecting capital gains growth of 5.2% in FY 2026, other non-withheld income tax at 4.2%, withheld income tax growing at 3.8%, corporate at 3.7%. We expect to see much more moderate, but though positive growth in sales tax at 1.2%. And we'd expect other tax collections to grow positive again, but at a relatively low level of 1.6%. So you combine all that together, you get the $40.9 billion. And then again, on the surtax side, we're projecting about $2.6 billion in surtax revenues in FY 2026. We're also recommending a surtax threshold of $1.75 billion, so that would be a $450 million increase over the threshold that's currently in use in fiscal year 2025. So that would, if you were to use that surtax threshold of 1.75, given the total projection we have, that would mean about $127.5 million for that Education and Transportation Reserve Fund, and about $723 million for the Education and Transportation Capital and Innovation Fund. So that's where we see revenues. I think bottom line, you keep in mind that in fiscal year 23 and 24, we effectively saw flat to actually slight declines in non-surtax revenues. So we expect in 25 and 26 to see moderate positive revenue growth. And I do think that part of that is really a credit to how the U.S. economy has handled the post-pandemic transition, right? When you look at how we've handled that compared to, I think, where a lot of expectations were, certainly when you compare us to other major economies, that transition has been relatively strong. And so that's why we think it warrants this positive, moderate positive outlook going forward. Now, I will say, and I'll get to this in a minute, there are certainly some kind of causes for concern, causes for caution moving forward, and it's absolutely, I think, critical to keep that in mind, but we think we've kind of accounted for that in that moderate projection in fiscal year 26. So just quickly, I do want to talk about 3 of these other elements that we view as central to the FY26 budget development process, and the first of them relates to the surtax. So this will be the third budget that would use the method that you all established a couple years ago to collect, track, and monitor surtax collections. And I think the bottom line is that method has been a success, right? You can clearly see in the budget where surtax collections are. We've put in place a sustainable level of surtax spending, much lower than collections, and that's enabled money to be set aside for reserve and for capital investment, right? So when you think about the things that we all talked about at this hearing a couple years ago, those are things we talked about, and I think that you see that in the general kind of architecture, whatever you think of the tax itself, in terms of the architecture of how you track it. However, I do think that now that we've got a full year of collections under our belts, there are a couple kind of tweaks or adjustments that we would recommend. First and foremost, I think when the consensus revenue figure is determined, it's critical that that number include an actual surtax estimate as opposed to the current operating budget threshold that's currently put in the benchmark. So the current benchmark, $41.6 billion, the surtax estimate in that is $1.3 billion, which is just the amount that's being spent in the budget. We know whether surtax goes up or down, it's likely to collect significantly more than that. And the challenge from a budget building standpoint that you folks know better than I is, it really makes it hard to use those benchmark gauges well. Right? Because you're not really sure. It can look like we're way above benchmark, but that actually may not be budget money available to the budget because of the surtax. And I think related to that, now that we have more data under our belt, being able to break out some level of estimate each month for surtax collections, even if there's an error range on that, I think is also going to be critical because surtax has to be used for certain things. A lot of it's not available to the budget. When you're looking at these monthly revenue returns and trying to figure out what that actually means to balancing the budget, it's just not as helpful information as it was prior to the surtax, and I think we can fix that. So those would be two recommendations we have. I think the third on the surtax is, right now, the surtax threshold you'll put in place, in a month or so, is the one you will live by 20 months from now, right? That it's in place until the closeout of the following fiscal year, and there's no mechanism to kind of transparently adjust that figure within a pretty, finite corridor. And so I do think it makes sense, and we'll have recommendations for this in the future about, is there a way to create, maybe it's like a 10% up or down corridor to adjust that number a little bit, just because right now, unlike really any other aspect of the budget, you're living with a number that was put in place really 20 months before you actually close out that fiscal year. So those are three things on the surtax we flagged. Two other things just very quickly. When I was here last year, one of the things we talked about was the importance of kind of changing the spending pattern in the fiscal year 25 budget compared to some of these pandemic-era budgets where spending was growing year over year at about 6%. And the budget that the governor put out last year, the House and the Senate, they really kept that spending under 3.5%. We actually ended up with a budget on the governor's desk at 3.1%, which I think was a really positive sign. I'm here to tell you I think it's equally important this year that we keep spending at 3% or less. Now, one of the reasons for that is I just got done telling you that we would estimate tax revenues to grow by 3.1%, right? And so it would make sense to kind of track those two numbers together. But there's kind of a larger global reason for that, which is as we think about the long-term structural stability of the budget, the spending decisions made now have such a huge impact in the budget next year and the year following in times when we have a lot of uncertainty. And to illustrate that, so during the pandemic, I mentioned spending grew, or budget signed by the governor spending grew by about 6% a year. If it had grown by 4% a year instead, the budget before you right now would be about $4 billion less than it is, right? Now, obviously that would have a variety of impacts, not just fiscally, but on policies as well. But it just, I think, illustrates this idea that the spending decisions made in the FY26 budget are going to be hugely important for building a balanced budget in 27, 28, 29, when we know there's a lot of risk factors. And that leads me to kind of the last broad point, which is, we know we're in for a 2/4 year roller coaster ride with what happens in Washington, D.C., right? We've got a new administration coming in. We've got a new Senate. And I think as you build the budget for fiscal year 2026, that's going to builds in a huge level of economic uncertainty, but also public finance uncertainty. Now, on the economic side, there are some potential positives, right, in terms of the fact that potential federal tax legislation in 2025, if in 2017 we saw an uptick in state tax collections, right? So you could have a short-term kind of boost there. However, my guess is you'll hear from some of the other people testifying as well, when you look at proposals related to tariffs or proposals related to immigration, you certainly see some concerns for the economy generally in terms of inflation and labor supply, but you also see some potential concerns that relate directly to Massachusetts. Now, who knows how that's all going to play out, but it's certainly something we want to kind of price that risk into the budget plan as we develop it. But I think finally, at a very practical level, there's been a lot of talk of kind of some real changes in the state-federal relationship on policies like Medicaid, right? Like infrastructure, like direct benefits. And those have a huge direct and indirect impact on our both capital and operating budgets. Now, we don't know what's going to happen. There's no need to kind of panic or take action for things that are unknown, but I do think when it comes to whether spending decisions and building a budget predicated on 3% revenue, 3% spending growth, I think that's a strategic way as well to hedge against a little bit some of that uncertainty when it comes to potential federal changes on Medicaid. As folks here know, next to the income tax, Medicaid reimbursements are the second largest source of revenue the Commonwealth receives, right? So, and it's a program that serves 2 million Massachusetts residents. So whether from a financial standpoint or a human service standpoint, the potential impacts there are huge. And Massachusetts, just like every other state, we can't replace federal dollars dollar for dollar, right? We don't have that capacity. So kind of building in a little bit of adaptability into this year's budget is another reason why we think that spending and revenue 3% moderate growth approach is the right way to go. And with that, that's my testimony. Appreciate the time.
Thank you, Doug, for your testimony, as always, and for your guidance through the process, not just today, but beyond. Back to the surtax tax conversation. I just wanted to ask one question related to, and you're right, I think the more years we go through this, the better off we'll have a better understanding and have a better, be able to have a more consistent approach. And my curiosity is, and while it's always difficult to predict year to year, how many years do you think of data will we need to really start to have a real good handle on exactly how this is going to play out from a predictability standpoint, potentially?
All I can tell you is it's not this year. No. And the challenge is it's also not the only factor, right? So when you look at some of the projections you're going to see on the surtax for fiscal year 25 and 26, some are going to show continued growth, some are going to show decline, and there's a couple factors in there, right? One of the factors is the behavioral impact of Massachusetts, the behavioral impact of policies that we enact in Massachusetts, namely putting a surtax on the book. But there are other behavioral factors as well, right? Like federal tax cuts or the growth of the economy writ large, right? And so the other thing that's going to be, I think, really challenging to disentangle is you can have the behavioral impacts that folks expected and still see those revenues grow, just as we're projecting capital gains revenues to grow by 5%. If surtax grows by 3%, well, maybe you'd expect it to grow by more if people weren't making different behavioral changes, but you could still see that built into those underlying revenues. What I do think makes some sense, and we talked about this a couple years ago, and I wonder if maybe we kind of back into this, the $2.4 billion number that Secretary Gorzkowicz mentioned, maybe it makes sense to kind of use that as a one-year lag for the projection in the following year. You know what I mean? So we had the $2.2 billion was the preliminary expectation. We now see 2.4. You heard that from DOR. That may be, who knows what direction it's going to go in. So maybe the most kind of conservative, small c conservative or strategic approach in 25 is to say, let's assume we're going to be at the 24 number. So then you at least build into yourself kind of a one-year lag on seeing those trends as they develop, because the challenge with it in all of these things, like with the economy underlying it, is disentangling the behavioral impact of the Massachusetts policy change from other stuff that's going on that we don't have any control over. You're never going to get a perfect answer on that. And so it'll be really interesting to see what that first year trend line is. Does it go up or does it go down, right? That's going to be really, I think, indicative of what we think we're seeing. And so sadly, future Doug will have to answer this question a little more accurately next year. But for now, I just think we don't know.
Okay, well, we look forward to that future Doug conversation. Chair Rodrigues.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Doug, it's great to see you. Great presentation. Megan coached you well, so she did. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I completely agree with you that as we, and I say collectively we, because you were involved, certainly created the process by which we collect and spend our surtax revenue, ensuring that it was open and transparent, that anyone can see clearly how much revenue is being collected by the surtax, and ensure that those dollars are truly being spent on education and transportation as the law was initially designed for. I do agree with you. Now that we have a couple years under our belt, right, we didn't know, we were shooting in the dark, an educated shot, but sure. Albeit that I welcome your invitation to work with you again, and I'm sure we'll work with our colleagues to maybe make some adjustments as we go forward, still ensuring that the collection and spending of the surtax is open and transparent, and that anyone can clearly see that it's being spent on solely education and transportation issues. But I do agree with you that it might need some tinkering, slightly, but still some tinkering to the structure, and I look forward to working with you on it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony and for working and thank you for the collaborative approach that you've taken working with us and your team. I appreciate that. I just wanted to sort of draw some parallels between the testimony you provided, and we've heard obviously from our Commissioner of Revenue and their forecast. And it sounds like your forecast for FY26 is fairly tightly correlated in that it sounds like you're projecting revenues to be a bit better in 25 than perhaps DOR's forecast, and the 3.1% that you're projecting for 26 again falls within the range that DOR has. So I just wanted to confirm that that is sort of correct, that you're assuming 3.1%, which gets us to a total of 40.9 billion for fiscal year 26. And I think the real difference in your forecast and DOR's is that you're assuming that FY25 is going to end the year slightly better than their forecast.
Correct. Yep.
Okay. And on the surtax discussion, appreciate your perspective on trying to put in place a number that is probably a bit more transparent and allowing us to track our benchmarks against that. We know that from a spending perspective, it seems like it does. We get past that number pretty quickly. Is there a number within the revenue that you would project be available for spending? And I assume when you were talking about the growth in the budget, the surtax is outside of that potentially.
Rephrase that question. I just want to make sure I understand
It's really two separate questions. Sorry for that.
Yeah.
The first is, within the revenue projections for surtax, is there any place within where we currently are in that estimate that you think is the appropriate amount for spending? Have you not thought about that? It's very fine if you haven't.
Yeah.
And then the second one is when you talk about the growth in spending, I assume that growth in spending does it or does it not include the surtax?
So the growth in spending is really all in, right? So that does include surtax. And what that means is that means you'd probably see greater spending increase on the education and transportation side, which would be kind of taken out of the other side of the budget, right? So that is an all-in number. In terms of the surtax, I think you're asking about kind of the $1.3 billion threshold in FY 2025 per se. So we don't have a formal recommendation on that yet. It's something we're looking at. But one thing that I do think is worth noting, right, which is when you look at the original DOR mid-range estimate for FY 2024 for the surtax and where we landed, the delta is like 20%. I think it's 21% or so, right? And so it really depends on the process that you all went through to kind of determine that number and where it is. But I do think that as we're building up the database of information we have on those collections, I do think that it is, exactly as Chair Rodrigues said, in a very transparent and clear way, saying, okay, what did we think the world was going to look like? What's different? And then what does that apply for other areas of the budget? What I would want to make sure in terms of the surtax threshold is it's critical to do that, I think, moving forward, right? I don't think you want to retrofit that on spending that's already been done sometimes, because I think that can get to issues of transparency. But I do think if you determine a way to kind of make some of those adjustments prospectively, provided there's consensus, and I think provided that it is a really transparent process on how that's done, I think that those are some of the things that we'll look at.
Thank you.
Vice Chair Ferrante.
The question I have is there's a lot of uncertainty coming into the next fiscal year.
Yep.
Of all of that uncertainty, what do you think the greatest vulnerability or threat is to the Massachusetts economy? And is it something that you think we can preventively work toward to eliminate that challenge?
So I would answer that in two ways. And the first way is just thinking about the exercise here today is on the state budget, right? And that really gets down to fundamental changes specifically to the Medicaid program, right? Whatever you think of how the program's run up, areas for improvement, not, the reality is, whether folks like it or not, that is $12 to $14 billion in on-budget revenue for the state, let alone some of the trust funds through the Medicaid waiver that were established in recent years. And fundamental changes there have a seismic impact on the budget. And again, as I mentioned, so our K-12 system educates 900,000 kids. Mass Health provides health care to more than double that, right? So just from an order of magnitude standpoint, that would be the biggest thing. And I think that what we can do, hopefully, is continue to talk with our delegation, continue to talk with folks, other states about how the program works, how critical that partnership is, I think, in red states and blue states and things like that. But I don't think we have unilateral ability to prevent changes, right? So there's a bit of it comes into adaptability as well. And then from a larger economic standpoint, I think what we've learned really now, going back to 2016, is who knows what the next year holds, right? In terms of whether it's, geopolitical things, whether it's terms of public health things, whether it's in terms of presidential administrations. And so I wouldn't want to say what I think is most likely to happen. What I would say is something is likely to happen, because that's what experience tells us over the last, certainly 8 years.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Senator Comfort?
Thanks so much, Doug, for this testimony and your counsel, as always. I wanted to pick up on Vice Chair Ferrante's question, and thank you for calling us to be adaptable and having the budget really be as nuanced and nimble a document as we need to meet these times. While we can't predict or maybe forestall anything that's going to happen in Washington, what should we do to prepare? Meaning, Medicaid, $12 to $14 billion. What would you suggest our budget do, and how would you structure it to be able to withstand any kind of impact?
I think the kind of reality is the wisdom of expanding existing programs right now, when there could be downside risk in terms of the bigger risk right now for me is losing some of the stuff that we have. And so I would be very thoughtful and mindful about how we manage through some of the, and we saw from 2021 to 2024 a pretty significant growth in the base of the budget, as I mentioned. And the ability to kind of sustain that and manage that, I think, is going to be a tall task, irrespective of what happens in D.C. And so I would just say, and it's easy for me to say, I don't have to go through the process of helping to put together the budget, but the biggest thing I would try to protect against is losing out on some of the investments that the Commonwealth has committed to in recent years, as opposed to building those further, at least for right now.
Helpful. And Mr. Chair, can I just ask a follow-up? But with regard to Medicaid, would you foresee a fund developed that had some, not rainy day, but some money set aside in the eventuality or potentially to again, fend off, forestall, whatever word we want, any withdrawal of funds from the federal government?
So
I understand you're talking to us about holding costs,
yep,
so that we have some ability to lean in.
And I guess what I would say on that is two quick things. One, that's a very thoughtful, critical question, I think, for folks to think about how to respond to potential federal action. And so let us think about that a little bit. And the other thing I would say is, we don't want to panic. We just want to prepare, right? And who knows what's going to happen, and who knows what the impacts of that are going to be. And so I would be a little hesitant to take an action that's really, until we potentially know a little more. I think the biggest action in the near term is to make sure we're not kind of overextending ourselves in other areas that's going to make it that much more challenging for us to be a little more nimble when it happens. And so, but let me think a little bit more. And there's, healthcare finance, like every area of the budget, is so complicated that I wouldn't want to off the cuff kind of give a suggestion that probably doesn't make any sense. So let me think a little bit more about it, and we can get back to you.
Terrific. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Doug.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Okay. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you.
Appreciate your testimony. Next up, we have Professor Michael Goodman from the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. Floor is yours, Professor. Thank you. Just hit the microphone.
Suppose I need to turn it on. Chair Michlewitz, Chair Rodrigues, Secretary Gorzkowicz, distinguished committee members, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you here today. My name is Michael Goodman. I'm going to offer some comments, and as I have in previous years, I'm going to focus more on macroeconomic conditions, the economic outlook, and several of the risk factors that you were just talking about. I do want to note, I'm an employee of the public university, but anything I say we can't blame my boss for. I'm here as an analyst and speak for myself. I think it's important to start the conversation on economic conditions by highlighting the incredible resilience and stability that we've seen in the Massachusetts economy in light of some of the most challenging times, biggest drops in economic activity, largest surges during the pandemic and since. And what we've seen over the last several years is, I think, the epitome of the soft landing, as we've managed to, through prudent state and federal policies, I think, navigate what's been a very challenging economic environment and come out the other side in a pretty solid set of economic conditions. And so I find myself cautiously optimistic when we're looking at the state macroeconomic fundamentals. Both state and national labor markets have softened, as was noted by previous testimony, but I do think we have to keep in mind that our labor market is in very strong condition. We went from extraordinary displacement during the pandemic, and now we're still lingering close to historic lows in our unemployment rate, even though the unemployment rate has ticked up recently in recent months and in recent quarters. I think that's been happening primarily for reasons that I would consider to be healthy. This is a snapshot of the decomposition of unemployment in the United States, or the change in the increase in the U.S. unemployment rate, and it tells a story that I think is quite similar to what we've been experiencing here in Massachusetts in recent months and quarters. What we've seen as much as any job losses is a reduction in voluntary quits, which is a sign of slowing and some stability, and re-entry into the labor market by folks who, for whatever reason, had not been participating, had stopped looking. Perhaps they were caring for a loved one, dealing with a personal illness. Now we're seeing return to the labor market, and that increases the labor force, and while people are searching for a job, it makes the unemployment rate look otherwise larger than it might. We've seen about 50% of that change, which has been quite modest, due to those healthy factors, people coming back into the labor market. And this is consistent with recent labor force data, which is quite, I think, encouraging. As you know, in Massachusetts, we face a number of demographic challenges, more on that in a moment. But in recent months, we've seen some very encouraging growth as that re-entry into the labor market has begun to put some more labor supply in. We've got very constrained labor force growth here in Massachusetts, which has been a governor on some of our economic opportunity and economic growth in the state. And so when we see labor force growth, it's very encouraging, even if it does make it look like the unemployment rate is a little higher than it was before. Again, I think a good part of that explanation is a positive story. And if we take a look back at consensus economic forecasts, and I'll note prior to the recent national elections, there is a consensus. This shows the chart you're able to see here now shows the consensus of the Wall Street Journal forecasters. There are several hundred private forecasters that are polled quarterly, and this is through October, and it suggests that roughly we've got about a 1 in 4 chance of recession according to those forecasters, which is extraordinarily low, consistent with that soft landing story that I told. Additionally, I think it's important to keep in mind that although the recent elections and public opinion have made it clear that high price levels are very distressing to people, the rate of inflation, or the rate of increase in consumer prices, particularly for goods, has moderated considerably, and the consensus looking out, again, prior to the election results, was that inflation rate was under control. And so that's sort of the textbook definition of a soft landing. And if you recall, in recent years, the folks that have been testifying here today, including myself, have been wondering out loud whether or not we were going to achieve that soft landing. It does seem to be here. And so we enter this uncertain period, as Doug was describing, with changes in national leadership and potentially distressing changes in national policy, in pretty solid shape. And I think that's an important baseline for you to start your conversation. But of course, needless to say, there have been some developments recently, and I think none of us truly know what's going to happen next, particularly given our experience between 2016 and 2020. Lots of things have been said, lots of things have been promised, and the real question for us is which things are going to get done. And my crystal ball isn't quite clear enough to tell you exactly what they're going to do, but I wanted to highlight some of the things that have already been raised by some of the folks testifying here today that give me concern, because I do think they're within the power of the president. without legislative support from the Congress, where there are very tight majorities, small majorities, and it would be very difficult, I think, to get contentious things done. But there are a number of issues that I think expose Massachusetts and the country to some risks that I think could affect our macroeconomic outlook to the downside and would certainly have meaningful implications for the fiscal condition of our Commonwealth. The first one that comes to mind, and it seems likely, is more severe immigration enforcement, including quote-unquote mass deportations that have been promised, along with several other things, apparently on the first day of the new administration. This is Moody's Analytics assessment of what would happen, and this was from August, in the event of a Republican sweep, that is Republican control of the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives, and what the impact would be on our industries, many of whom in the US and here in Massachusetts rely very heavily on foreign-born labor, whether documented or not. When we think about the industries that are most exposed, these are the industries that are seasonal, so agriculture comes to mind, and that's certainly a big deal in certain parts of our state. Manufacturing, construction and building trades, where labor has already been quite tight, and significantly leisure and hospitality, one of our larger employers that supports tourism as well as hospitality, restaurants, hotels, et cetera. So when we think about a state like ours, where we're not growing the population very quickly, where we're heavily reliant on international migration as a source of labor force growth, this really does cause concern. Even tough talk, in our experience from 2016 to 2020, discourages the foreign-born, whether they have an immigration status or not that's legal, from sending their kids to school, reporting to work, alerting the authorities when there's a crime, and it makes these communities quite vulnerable. And so the disruptive effects of the tough talk, let alone the potential impacts of the severe enforcement, could have, as you see here, very significant impacts on key industries, both here in Massachusetts and nationally. It's going to restrict their ability to hire. It's going to make it difficult for them to deliver on their business promises and to take advantage of economic opportunities. And in a state like ours, it leaves us quite vulnerable in the event that those promises are followed through on. I would say mass deportations, like the kind of door-to-door raid stuff, would be highly disruptive, as they would discourage people, even who weren't vulnerable, from reporting to work, participating in society, and doing all the things that we want people to do. I would say at the other end, this isn't just about our most vulnerable immigrants or about recent migrants or blue-collar foreign-born members of our labor force in our community. It's also about the next generation of innovators. Here in Massachusetts, our growth advantage is really due to our innovation economy. Think life sciences, climate technology, advanced manufacturing, marine science and technology. It runs the gamut, and we've traded on that advantage for many years. And in a slow-growing population, we've come to rely very heavily in higher education, particularly private higher education, on international students who generally pay full freight, who come, and if we're lucky, stay and become major league contributors to that innovation economy. We know what happened between 2016 and 2020. These two charts show how reliant some of our largest and most counter-cyclical employers in the state are. Private and public universities at scale. You can see here Northeastern relies on over 20,000 full-paying international students each year. Boston University, MIT, the University of Massachusetts Amherst. These will be significantly disruptive developments for those students and for the bottom line of those institutions. And when students don't feel welcome here, as they didn't between 2016 and 2020, they will find other places to relocate to become educated in, and to contribute to ultimately in the future. You can see in the right-hand chart the trend in international student matriculations in the US during 2016 to 2020, and the drop-off started well before the pandemic. So this is a major area of concern, both as a pipeline for skilled labor and as a means of fiscal and financial and other support for some of our most important and largest employers. This is a bit of an eye chart, but it really highlights the potential range of impacts related to some of the tax policies that have been proposed by the incoming administration. I highlight two that have come up before, both done by the Nonpartisan Tax Policy Center in DC, which is a collaboration between the Urban Institute and the Brookings Institution. One highlights the impact of tariffs, which, interestingly enough, and I think it's revealing, are modeled here like an excise tax, because those tariffs essentially add costs to either end goods that are imported or component parts that our manufacturers and other businesses rely upon to deliver their goods to market. Those prices, and there's no real meaningful debate about this, find their way to the end user and cost the end user more. So it's either going to be end user consumers in the US paying more, and they make some assessment of what that means. It means lower disposable income because you're paying higher prices, or it makes goods manufactured in the US and Massachusetts more expensive abroad because the component parts have gone up thanks to the tariffs. And typically when we impose tariffs on our trading partners, they match those tariffs in exchange. And so it's a bit of a race to the bottom in economic terms. So the tariff policy definitely taketh away. I learned today that the cap on SALT deductions does have an indirect negative impact on our bottom line that I hadn't considered prior to preparing this testimony. It does put some dollars in the pockets of some of our residents and may be good for households who don't have the benefit of a pass-through entity to obtain the tax credit to offset. But obviously it would be good for some of our taxpayers, especially our upper middle income and above taxpayers, even though it's pretty clear from earlier testimony that it would also have a shockingly large and negative impact on tax revenues at the state level. So tax policy changes, I think, will be very interesting, should give some relief to some of our higher income earning households, many of whom have been complaining of late about taxes. This should relieve some of that concern for whatever that's worth. The other thing I would notice is it's not just talent, whether domestically produced or internationally imported talent, that fuels the innovation economy. It's our ability to win our disproportionate fair share of these merit-based competitions for science funding and for research and development funding. I highlight here just one source of those funds, the National Institutes of Health, where we've got numerous institutions, some of our leading healthcare institutions, some of our leading medical schools and research institutions receiving substantial sums in competitively awarded grants. The potential appointment of RFK Jr., who among other things is an anti-science person, suggests that there may be moves away from the kind of peer-reviewed based evaluation of scientific R&D proposals. As one of the leaders in the world in these areas, we would stand to lose pretty significantly, which would add insult to injury to some of those institutions who would be feeling that crunch as a result of expected immigration policy as well. So this is certainly an area of concern that would have impact, again, on very stable, very large scale, and very sort of recession immune employers, our healthcare institutions. Doug mentioned the major concerns about potential changes in the way Medicaid reimbursements are organized and funded at the federal level. There have been public commitments, and I believe Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy have been hired to find $3 trillion in savings on an annual basis from the federal budget. So I think I'm as skeptical as you are that that's possible, but I know the incoming president has said that Medicare and Social Security will not be touched. And so if you just look at the components of the federal budget, there aren't too many large lines there, and Medicaid is one of those lines. Over the last 10 years, this has come up a couple of times, and it could take the form of a per capita cap on federal reimbursements or some block granting. In either case, it could be potentially devastating on the cost side for the state, as Doug Howgate pointed out. I do think, to a question that was raised earlier, that if I was going to plan for this potential likelihood, I would be planning for how I wanted to tighten eligibility and manage expenses, because I think it's very difficult for me to imagine that we would be able to reserve enough funds to maintain the status quo in the event of a significant reduction in federal Medicaid reimbursements. This seems to me more like a high-impact, lower probability outcome, given the politics and the tight margins in both the Senate and the House, but it is certainly something that bears watching and has extraordinarily high stakes. The other issue, I think, that has longer-term fiscal implications, but certainly undermines a major policy goal of the Commonwealth, concerns climate action and climate change, particularly the development of renewable energy. Here in Massachusetts, we're not home to reserves of oil or of natural gas, even if we were inclined to explore for them, which we are not. But we do have one of the richest sources of offshore wind and have made sizable investments in both southeastern Massachusetts and more recently in Salem to prepare for that coming revolution. There are numerous projects in the pipeline. The federal government has extraordinarily strong control over the use of federal waters. The incoming president has made it clear that he doesn't like offshore wind. You can see that quote. It's rather strong. And that so disrupting this development would really have economic development costs for the state. I do think this new industry, if we can get out of its way, is ready to make major investments in a U.S. supply chain, and Massachusetts could be competitive for that. But I do think we're likely to see a delay there, which could have implications for the pace of our progress towards decarbonization and the Commonwealth's goals on the one hand, and the price of energy, because I know the independent system operator of New England is planning on these facilities helping to meet our energy needs, and in the absence of that capacity, we're going to have to import that electricity, and we're going to pay a heavy price for it. So I think on the cost of doing business and the cost of living side, that is something that is worth paying attention to, as it could slow economic growth, lead to some hard decisions on the regulatory side, and have I think, on balance, net effect, negative effect on the economy, the fiscal outlook, and certainly the progress towards the achievement of our climate goals. All of that being said, as you well know, the Commonwealth has been very careful and prudent in how it's managed its resources throughout the pandemic and its aftermath. I think you all have been wise stewards of those resources, and we are now over $9 billion in the stabilization fund reflects that. I do think we are able to ride out whatever comes next. Based on the best information we have today, I think economic conditions are likely to be solid, if moderate, in terms of our growth and our growth prospects. What truly concerns me at this time is the potential intended and unintended consequences of some major federal policy changes, some of which I've highlighted for you today. None of us knows what's going to happen next, but the stakes are high, and I think it's going to be a very interesting year. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Appreciate your testimony. I don't have any questions. Just want to thank you for your continued coming to these revenue hearings and giving us a good perspective on these things, and obviously delving into a little bit of some of the challenges that we face. We appreciate your perspective.
Thank you.
I want to turn it over to my colleague.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Michael, it's great to see you, and thank you for that great presentation. I just saw you maybe less than 2 weeks ago, and you had yet begun to prepare for this.
My head was still spinning a little bit.
Yes, yeah. So you've done a very good job. Thank you very much. We appreciate always you taking the time to present to us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm also good, thank you. I appreciate your time and testimony today. Thanks.
Much appreciated. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you all.
Well done, Vice Chair Ferranti.
Sorry.
Thank you, Professor, for coming today. You certainly outlined a number of scenarios where we could have a shock to the labor system. And you and I both know the most fundamental formula in economics is capital times labor. And it seems as though what's coming may hit at both angles of that.
Yes.
So, you know, in my mind, when I hear that and I hear what's coming and the probability that if the incoming president says it, he's probably going to do it, That's what we've learned by him. Should we be worried about any type of recession? A recession happening, not necessarily nationally, but within our state, because we're dependent upon the Medicare funding, we're dependent upon the life sciences funding, we're depending upon the climate change funding for economic growth and the delivery of jobs and taxpayers?
I'm not worried about us moving from growth into contraction or from moderate expansion into a recession. But I am worried that the disruption associated with the most severe immigration enforcement scenario would be highly disruptive and probably would have bigger and more acute regional effects in areas of the state that are much more reliant on seasonal industries. I'm thinking about agriculture, travel, and tourism. So certain parts of southeastern Massachusetts, certain parts of western Massachusetts, which rely, who are significant players in agriculture, could be exposed. Also, other industries that rely heavily on foreign-born labor. I live in New Bedford, so I'm thinking about fish processing, and certainly from Gloucester, you understand that. And so, and then also a pressure on our community hospitals. I think anytime you have staffing challenges, it's going to be difficult. So even universities and hospitals may find it more difficult to recruit people who would have been very happy to be here otherwise because of the change in tone in the nation. We saw some of that 2016 to 2020. Does it push us backwards? No, I don't believe so, unless the worst case scenario of all of the darkest promises are fulfilled. I think I've been trying to focus my attention in preparing for today on the kinds of things that seem plausible. You can craft all kinds of different scenarios. I think we'll get through, but I think there will be displacement and pain, and it won't be felt evenly.
Okay.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from members of the committee? Representative Kearney.
First of all, thank you so much for your testimony. I really appreciate it. Quick question as it relates to some of the things that you're anticipating over the next 4 years, specifically in regards to energy prices. You were talking about offshore wind construction and that impacting energy prices. The average cost of a per kilowatt hour electricity when it comes from natural gas is like 6.5 cents per kilowatt hour.
Yeah.
It's like 13 cents per kilowatt hour from offshore wind. So I'm trying to understand how the delay in the construction of something that is almost twice as expensive is going to impact households negatively. I can see why it would impact our climate goals. I just don't know how it's going to impact tax collections.
I'm not familiar with the 17 cents one. I haven't seen the latest bid prices. I know they're forthcoming apparently next year. So I would want to test that premise. I know the first Wind 1 project, which I've studied pretty intensely, the bid price came in at basically at the wholesale electricity price at that time. Subsequently, through this period of inflation, the costs, in part associated with regulatory delays during the 2016 through 2020 period, did push those prices up. I will say the bigger concern for me is that we have to import all of our fossil fuels from other parts. So it's not simply the climate goals, but it's also the need to purchase natural gas and oil on the spot market, particularly during peak periods especially when it gets very cold here, and we pay through the nose for that. So I think that levelized cost of energy, I think, underestimates the vulnerability to these price spikes. We, without any of the offshore wind, already have some of the highest retail electricity prices, either for industrial or consumers in the country. And so I think part of that problem has been the lack of a domestic energy source that we can rely upon, and the inability to have any kind of economic opportunity to participate in that energy industry. So when we import that industry, we're essentially sending money out of the state to purchase the electricity. If we produce it here, then we're benefiting from the jobs that are created, the opportunities for the supply chain, the opportunities for smaller and local businesses. I would tell you that if you want to look at the net price, you should look at some of our port cities that have made sizable investments in their capacity to take on this new industry. I will say that over time, that electricity price situation that you mentioned is going to have to be addressed. But I do think it's our, frankly, I think our one best chance for domestic energy here in Massachusetts. And so even if it would temporarily increase the prices over time, I think we would be better off.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Okay. Thank you, Professor. Appreciate your testimony. Next up, we have Evan Horowitz from the Center of State Policy Analysis at Tufts University. Floor is yours, sir.
No. Now it's on. Thank you for inviting me to testify today. I always enjoy helping the Commonwealth address complicated times. It seems like it's always complicated times, so anytime I'm asked to help, it's in complicated times. My name's Evan Horowitz. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for State Policy Analysis at Tufts, abbreviated as CSPA. We provide timely research on live policy issues in a strictly nonpartisan manner. We work on fiscal and economic policy, assess the impact of ballot questions, and provide consulting services and technical support to organizations. I want to talk about 4 things today, which vary from a lot of the testimony that has come so far. First, I'll share our revenue expectations for the remainder of this fiscal year. Second, our projections for FY26. Third, a little bit about the balance of economic and fiscal risks in the year ahead. And finally, I'll talk about a worrisome puzzle related to millionaires' tax collections. So, to start, we think that Massachusetts is likely to exceed its revenue benchmark for FY25. Our simulations suggest that the state will end the fiscal year with tax collections between $41.4 and $42.4 billion, with a bulk of likely outcomes above the $42 billion threshold. That's an all-in number, including millionaires' tax revenue and other revenue sources. Given the strength of the stock market and the new seasonal patterns of millionaires' tax collections, we see a very high probability of April outperformance, which is the biggest reason the state is likely to end the year with a meaningful surplus. Now, despite our relative optimism about final collections, we don't think it's necessary or appropriate to adjust the FY25 benchmark upward at this time. There's simply too much uncertainty to start counting chickens. For FY26, we estimate that the state tax revenues for next fiscal year will total $44.5 billion, 7% above this year's benchmark, roughly 5% above our updated estimate of final 2025 collections. This, again, is an all-in number, which includes adjustments for both the millionaires' tax and other recent tax policy changes. Taken in isolation, we expect the millionaires' tax to generate $2.4 billion in FY26. So I guess if you're doing the math, it's $42.1 billion in non-millionaires' tax revenue, $2.4 billion in millionaires' tax revenue, and a total of $44.5 billion. And again, that $2.4 billion is a measure of direct collections subject to the spending restrictions in the constitutional amendment, which is a caveat I want to talk about at greater length in a little bit. Our estimate is based on a predictive model that uses U.S. GDP to gauge likely state taxes. Historically, there's been a nearly one-to-one correlation between national GDP and Massachusetts tax revenues because GDP reflects exactly the kinds of things that we tax, namely income and spending. Now, building on this relationship, we can project state tax revenues using existing estimates of U.S. GDP, which are produced by a range of reputable public and private organizations, including the Conference Board, the Wall Street Journal Economic Forecasting Survey. Gathering these together, we find a general consensus that economic growth is likely to slow somewhat from the nearly 3% pace of recent quarters and return to roughly 2% through calendar year 2025 and into 2026. At the same time, we see inflation settling into a range between 2 and 2.5%, just above the Federal Reserve's target, and slow enough to recede from public consciousness. It's important to note that while our forecast is relatively sanguine, we expect significant volatility over the next 18 months, not least due to the shifting priorities of the incoming administration. This seems like a reason to choose a conservative revenue benchmark, somewhat below the $44.5 billion projected level. Most prominent among these downside risks are sweeping policy shifts, such as broad tariffs, large-scale deportations, and unfunded tax cuts. Each has hard-to-predict macroeconomic implications, but the full suite would almost certainly put upward pressure on inflation and interest rates. At the same time, financial markets look overstretched on several key measures, which is likely to boost capital gains and millionaires' tax revenue this year, which is one reason we expect an April outperformance, but could easily lead to a pullback in FY26. In a more optimistic key, there are signs of rare economic resilience in the U.S. and state economy. Recent quarters have seen remarkably strong productivity growth, which could continue as we integrate AI tools into more areas of the economy. And while it's impossible to rule out a recession, the odds of a deep downturn seem slim thanks to pent-up demand for borrowing. Any signs of economic turmoil will lead to interest rate cuts, which will promote home sales and home equity loans that can steady the economy. So you can imagine a kind of shallow downturn, but Federal Reserve action is likely to stimulate tremendous consumer power through borrowing. So finally, I want to discuss some preliminary takeaways from the first full year of the Massachusetts millionaire's tax, including the gap between headline collections and net revenue. The key thing to understand about the millionaire's tax is that it doesn't simply create a new stream of revenue, though it does that. It also reduces the revenue we collect through the standard income tax, thanks to taxpayers who leave the state or engage in tax avoidance. Now, in previous years, I've mentioned these trade-offs in theoretical terms, but we can now begin to measure them more concretely using collection figures from FY24. Our analysis suggests that the $2.2 billion, and again, this was working off the certified number. I'll comment on the adjustment in a second. That the $2.2 billion in certified millionaires' tax collections was offset by a loss of roughly $850 million in income taxes. Now, I haven't had time to rerun this, but the key thing to understand is with millionaires' taxes now estimated at $2.4 billion, that actually increases the size of losses because they're still under the same total revenue. So if our total revenue is the same, but a larger share of it was millionaires' tax than was included in our model, that means the offsetting losses in other areas were larger, more likely closer to $1 billion. As yet, it's unclear how to apportion these offsetting losses. While some declines likely reflect behavioral changes among high earners, whether moving out of state or shielding their earnings, other potential factors include the early implementation of last year's tax cut package, the delayed effects of higher interest rates, and the noise that comes from working with just 1 year's worth of data. But it's vital for the state to track these potential offsets, as they can't be neatly balanced against gains. We're talking about slightly different kinds of dollars, as the millionaire's tax collections come with spending restrictions, but the losses count against general revenue. So you can end up creating budget holes that you can't easily patch with the millionaire's tax. This mismatch is compounded when you include the effects of the 2023 tax cuts, which also reduce the number of unrestricted dollars. Considered broadly, we find that the combined tax changes of the last few years, meaning the millionaire's tax and the 2023 tax cuts thought of together, have had a meaningful net impact, increasing total tax revenues by roughly $500 to $700 million per year. But they've also created a mismatch where we lose all-purpose dollars, but gain revenue with spending limitations. I'd like to thank you for inviting me to participate today. I'm happy to answer questions on this or any of these issues, and we're always around to do additional research and be helpful.
Thank you, Evan, as always. Appreciate your testimony, your perspective, and appreciate you with the optimism for FY25. I'd open up to my counterparts here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Evan, thank you very much again for your testimony. I do not have your testimony in writing. Would you be able to circulate for us? We'd appreciate that. Yep.
Shall I come up to now? Should I leave them here? What's easiest?
You can get it for us, and we can circulate it amongst our members. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your testimony. Appreciate it. I did have one quick question. I know you had mentioned $2.4 billion as your surtax estimate for FY26. What was the base you were planning off for 24? You were using the...
Yes, I would use 2.2 as the base.
Okay, you used
so if I were rerunning now, they were sort of inflation and wealth adjusted numbers, so it probably ends up, I mean, maybe it's $100 million difference. You end up at 2.5 or something, 2.55. Yeah.
Okay. That's helpful. Thank you.
Open up to questions or comments from members of the committee. Oh, okay. Thank you, Evan. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And last on our agenda is Professor Alan Clayton Matthews from Northeastern University.
Good afternoon, Chairs Rodrigues and Michlewitz and Secretary Gorzkowicz. Thank you for inviting me here to testify today. So I think you're getting the handouts now, and there are also slides. But let's start with the next slide, which is the summary of these revenue projections. So for fiscal year 2025, I'm projecting, and these numbers, by the way, include the surtax and capital gains. So they may look high, but everyone else has been subtracting out the surtax, and we'll see the surtax estimates in a moment. But for fiscal year 2025, 43.4 billion, 6.4% growth over fiscal year 24. Fiscal year 2026, 45.9 billion, 5.8% growth over fiscal year 25. And included in these numbers are the capital gains expectations of 3.38 billion in fiscal year 25 and 3.59 billion in fiscal year 26. And these are the capital gains expectations excluding the surtax portion of those. On the next slide, I have the assumptions about the surtax in these projections, and I have them both by tax year liability, that's one way to think of them, and then fiscal year revenue collections. And these estimates are, slightly below those of the Department of Revenue. I haven't been able to model this yet. I haven't had the time yet, but Chair Michlewitz, you asked, was it Doug Howgate? Are these predictable? And the answer is yes, they are. They kind of flow from three main sources. One is capital gains, and less than half, but a sizable proportion of these surtax revenues are from capital gains. And then another sizable chunk is from high-income earners, and it shows up in withholding forms. And then the remainder of that are most of the remainder comes from small businesses, proprietors' income, and dividend interest and rental income. So to the extent you can forecast each of these components, and you can reasonably do that, you can forecast the surtax. And the Department of Revenue has the information, and they have been giving good guidance on that because they can look at the withholding forms, they can look at forms when they come in, they know where the sources of income are. So this is something that is forecastable, and it can vary quite a bit from year to year, but I think less so than the capital gains tax revenues, because more than half of it comes from revenue streams which are less volatile than the financial markets. And the economic assumptions behind these estimates are essentially a sanguine economy. So I'm not assuming anything in these numbers about the impacts of the new administration on the national or state economies. In any case, I think those impacts will take a while, so we're likely to feel them later in fiscal year 26 and 27 than the fiscal year we're in now. But it assumes, for example, Massachusetts GDP growth, which is growing about the same rate as the national economy, a little bit slower in fiscal year 26 because of slower employment growth. But it's also assuming continued growth in payroll employment, slow growth, but my expectations are actually brighter than they were a year ago for the near future, and that's because the economy has performed better. Reasonable growth in personal income, in wage and salary income, Some of the factors that are affecting the expectations here are corporate profit growth, and my estimates there are from the Federal Reserve Board's October forecast. Those affect, of course, things like capital gains, also corporate tax liability as well, and interest rates. And I'd like to go to the last slide to note something about that. So this is a graph of the 10-year interest rate in blue, and that's largely impacted by Federal Reserve policy. And the line below it in red is subtracting the rate of inflation, so that gives you the 10-year real interest rate. And the Fed policy works through affecting these interest rates. And the thing to note there is how sharply these fell at the beginning of the COVID cycle, and how sharply they rose again. And so I think these help to explain both the revenue surprises we saw on the positive side a couple of years ago, and the revenue dismay we had the last fiscal year or two, and it's related to these swings in interest rates, which affect financial markets. It affects broadly the economy, and it affects a lot of incomes of high-income earners. So we've borne the brunt of that already. And now, not that interest rates are falling or low, but they're not rising now. And that should be impacting our revenues going forward in the latter half of fiscal year 25 and fiscal year 26. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Once again, obviously, as with everyone, appreciate your time, your testimony, your optimism as well.
Yeah, these aren't optimistic, though. The only optimism here is that I don't see anything tilting the economy off its course, its gradual course that it's on. Otherwise, they're balanced, neither optimistic nor pessimistic. I rely on statistical models.
Yes. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
To my colleagues.
Again, to say thank you.
Great.
You for showing up every year and providing us with testimony that we need as we begin to craft the budget. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you.
I also want to thank you and appreciate the time you spend on that forecast and sharing it with us. I did have one question as it relates to sort of Treasury rates and and I don't know if you've done any modeling or forecasting, and if you haven't, it's fair, but just thinking about that in terms of recent federal policy and reducing rates and the impact that might have on the housing market and housing development here in Massachusetts. And what do you see going forward? I mean, what I'm hearing, and the reason why I'm asking the question is that while we've seen some rate reductions, it hasn't been significant enough to get sort of the market churning again. And I'm just curious if your forecasts have taken a look at
Well, the forecast here relied on the Federal Reserve Board's projections, and both their projections and what economists are hearing about what interest rates are likely to be over the course of the next few years is not good in terms of interest rates falling much. And that's because there are several things that should keep them higher than they were before COVID, when they were very low. And that's largely large federal deficits. And that means that to get the borrowing, you have to entice people to buy the bonds, and those interest rates have to go up. And the other thing that's will likely affect interest rates is trade policy. If there are tariff increases and they affect the balance of trade, so we're importing less and exporting more. What happens when we import, like a lot of stuff from China? Dollars flow to China, and what happens to those dollars? They buy treasury bonds. And that increases the demand for those long-term bonds. and that lowers their interest rates. If the trade is going in the other direction now, that's going to have the opposite effect. And so I wouldn't expect interest rates to fall, certainly not sharply, and not much over the next couple of years. Yeah.
Vice Chair Ferrante.
Thank you, Professor, for your testimony this afternoon. I'm looking at the slide on page 2. I think it's the 4th slide that says key economic measures.
Sure.
And if I look at FY26, all of the numbers in that column, except for the stock index, are less than the numbers in FY25. And so as I look at that, again, my concern is there going to be, should we be considering that there's a possibility that economic growth may slow down as well as revenues?
Well, demographics are having an impact on slowing the growth in Massachusetts and nationally as well. Simply the aging workforce, and to the extent that foreign net immigration doesn't fill in that growth, we would expect slower growth going forward. But if you're just looking at this small timeline, a lot of this is also just affected by year-over-year averages that are due to a little bit sharper growth recently, and it going back to sort of normal slow growth in the near future. Yep.
I just want to clarify, you interpret that as slow growth and not negative growth?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. There's no knowing, when there will be a recession at some point, but there's nothing right now that's indicating one is coming. Sometimes that does happen, like the Great Recession we had. There were indications that the financial markets were in disarray. There aren't any indications like that now, but usually recessions occur in a way that you're blindsided by something that happens in the national economy, in the global economy, or geopolitically, and who knows.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time and testimony. That concludes our hearing today for the FY26 consensus revenue budget, and we will have a happy holidays and look forward to seeing you in 2025. Thank you.